Good afternoon. Hopefully today to finish the series of sermons about the International Year of the Child. When I started off, I thought that it was something that was totally beneficial, honest, and above board and all that, and we found out as we look into it that the International Year of the Child can lead to a fulfillment of prophecy as far as the courts and the law and as far as the destruction of the family is concerned. Even though the initial motive was good, laudable, altruistic, yet, as in most cases, if something is not guided, as atomic energy and hydrogen energy and all the rest, it can be a very destructive force. But God still would have us to be concerned for children, and hopefully this will be a sort of a concluding sermon in that particular set. So as far as the sermon is today, they're a sort of a compilation of many things that have been said before, but as Phoebe, my wife, was helping me with this, as sometimes she does, under duress, she's usually drafted at certain times. Well, then she said, haven't you said many of those things before? And I thought, well, no, because see, we've been married for a number of years, and she's heard them often, and she thinks maybe you've heard them too, but nevertheless, repetition is a good teacher. And I think one of the cardinal examples of that in the Bible is the four Gospels. All four, basically, about Jesus Christ, but all four from a different standpoint, but how many of us could really remember everything it said there? So then I'd like to sort of entitle this, Prepare for the Prophesied Difficult Times Ahead. Now it has to do with the family and the children, but prepare for the prophesied difficult times ahead. Now I won't be going into prophecy necessarily as far as chronology, but certainly as we go over here, I hope you'll begin to see that something's really happening in the world. It could be just time and chance. It might be a little bit more than that. But certainly, forewarned is forearmed, and it's not going to hurt us to be prepared. So then in Mr. Armstrong's Pastor General letter, there's just a couple of paragraphs I'd like to read from the bulletin that we got this month. And Mr. Armstrong says, prepare to greatly reduce your standard of living. Prepare to greatly reduce your standard of living. He says, I am in the process of finishing an article under the above headline for the January Plain Truth. He says he wants the ministers to keep the congregations aware of the crescendo of world troubles, how now speeding up the prophecies related to the end times. So he says, prepare to greatly reduce our standard of living. And I'll turn over to the very end, the last few paragraphs here. And it was said that we may well expect the Lord Jesus to now speed up events and bring this work to a speedy end. He mentioned that it seemed to be kind of hanging for a while. It seemed as if God were holding things back. And now with the way things are going in the world, it might be a sign that God is speeding things up. And to go on, he says, this is all the more reason why we need to wake up to the signs of the times and redouble our time on our knees, our searching of our own souls, he says, our spirit of repentance toward God, and increasing faith in Jesus Christ. So these are some of the things he thinks that we need to wake up to. And the last verse says, sound the alarm in deadly earnest, in deadly earnest, to God's people before the congregation. Said, we are the one and only true church of God, the soon to become bride of Jesus Christ. And when he comes, we must be ready. But we are not yet ready. Sounds kind of like prophecy of Paul. Yet we are now making good progress. He says, keep it up. So he says, sound the alarm. Of course, I think if you've been anywhere near a TV set or a radio or the news or even the ear at the barber shop or the beauty parlor, wherever, you've heard about the recent events concerning Iran and the many things that are happening. It's almost a whirlwind-like thing. It's almost makes you kind of, dizzy, as it were, concerning the very fact that the Americans have been taken hostage over there and the fact that there has to be a lot of diplomacy involved, or 60 people might die. But I certainly just want to mention that a little as far as unity is concerned. Many people study America like some people who really want something study other people. I used to say that men study women when they have a goal in mind. Of course, vice versa. But it seems that when we get what we want, we forget how we got it, and in the right time, we don't use it. But anyway, people have studied America. And so now they have some black Marines over there, and they have women over there, and they have some non-Americans over there, and they have some American Caucasians over there. So now they decided that because Islam respects women, they're going to let the women go. And they decided that since the blacks are oppressed, they're going to let the blacks go, and the ones they plan to keep is the American Caucasians. But yet they know that something has occurred as a result of them taking the Americans captive, that they are actually causing the country to bind together for the first time in years. They know that. But in their wisdom, they say, stop. No, how can we stop what we're doing? Everybody over there, they're not fighting anymore. They're all talking as one person. They're talking about what we're doing to them and what they're going to do to us. So what do? We take the women and we let them go. So that stops the women over here, but we don't have to bother anymore. So look, let those blacks get out of here till later on. We'll get them. No, they didn't say that, but they said, let them go, and then that'll make them stop. And of course, there's a black ministerial caucus now that is once again saying things concerning the Americans, concerning what's going on over there, and they don't know what's in store for them. But anyway, the attempt is to stop the progress of unity, to eliminate the concentration on our internal problems here. The crisis over there has begun to do that, but they have begun to diffuse that now. They realize that a crisis generally draws people together. So that's one reason why they think that they're going to let the blacks go and the women go, and a lot of us are kind of naive enough to think that they're sincere and we don't have anything more to bother about. That's no way. The Bible speaks about the church of this world as her ways are movable, so that you can't tell what she's doing. So then men are that way. So then God goes on to show us that there are a number of things that are occurring. The Cambodian situation over there, even immediately, and maybe in the future I'll mention something about the very fact of the earthquake that occurred in Iran right after they made one of their very strong proclamations where there were 600 people killed. Now some people would say, boy, God's getting them. And you know he may be, but you need to understand prophecy that when God uses a person to punish one person, he may punish that person because their attitude in doing it is not right. But that still doesn't mean that the person that was initially supposed to be punished will not be punished. So maybe God did let that earthquake happen. It's supposed to wake people up to realize that this nation represents more than just what its leaders stand for. But yet that's not to our credit necessarily. So God goes on to show, and not God, but then as far as a crisis is concerned, they know that a crisis draws people closer together. And that's why they've changed their approach. They're going to let some people go. But yet, what they don't realize is that a prolonged crisis causes people to lose feeling for each other. So instead of them trying to relieve the pressure, perhaps if they were wise, worldly wise, not godly, they would just let the pressure stay here, because when we have to go to the long pumps, we have to face winters without food, without heat, and when our job situation worsens over here, eventually we will be at each other's throats. And God knows that will occur even in his family. So that's why Mr. Armstrong is being inspired to prepare for a greatly reduced standard of living. I had an opportunity to talk to the father of one of our members here. He just found out, as usual, he's been a strong individual most of his life, a hard-working man, and at age 74, a couple of days ago, he found that he had leukemia and it's terminal. And therefore, he said if he takes chemotherapy, he may live 3 months, and if he doesn't take that, they have nothing that they can say about how much he may live, how long. But yet, he was referring back, as I went to see him, about the depression of the 30s. And he just went on, and he just talked about the 30s. He was born in 1904, I think. And therefore he talked about the things he saw, and the attitude that people had toward each other, and how in the Depression, how he and his wife had no debts, they had no money, but yet they actually had managed their finances to the place in cooperation with each other that they had no debts at the time of the bank crash. And he went on to show how people cooperated, how the price of a bushel of corn was around 5 cents a bushel, that if a person sold eggs, it was maybe around 12 or 10 cents a dozen. And he went on to express those times, the difficulties of those times, but the amazing thing was the attitude and the self-restraint that people exercised in such difficult times. And he says, but today, now as far as we know, he does not have God's Spirit. I imagine, knowing his son, and I say this respectfully, that he probably knows a bit about the church, because his son's not the kind of person to let him get away unscathed. He realizes that if we have another depression, like the one we had in the 30s, society is going to begin to be something that's going to frighten you half to death. Because people have more now than they did then. People have seen more. They have enjoyed more. They have a greater vision as far as what they want, and they aren't about to let it go and let you have it like they did back in the 30s. Witness the people going around, and they even built these things to protect your gas tanks. Now I better get back to my sermon here. In order for people not to take your gas because they think they need it more than you do. So then as the crisis comes, it says prepare to greatly reduce your standard of living. But remember, a crisis draws people together, but a prolonged crisis causes people to lose feeling for each other. So hence, maybe you'll find, and I may jump to this at this particular time, there's something that counters the golden rule as far as mankind is concerned. And it's called reciprocity, I think. And reciprocity is an observance of human action that shows that people will usually respond to the way that they are treated. Now, I hadn't even thought about this when I first heard the word until I thought about the golden rule. The way man actually is programmed is that he will respond to the way that he is treated, and he, in a sense, expects others to respond the same way. But God's golden rule is, on which hangs all the law and the prophets, is that as you would that men should do to you, do you even so to them. Don't do to them what you know they're going to do to you. Don't do to them what, because they're human, they're expected to do. Do to them as you would want them to do. Now that takes character. The other is the way the world does, and as a result of that, being sort of the guideline for all human relationships, because we do to others as they do to us, resentment and hostility is built up. And that resentment and hostility must be vented on somebody. It's residual. And hence, if you look at some of the prophecies, maybe you'll turn to Isaiah 3. There are many verses that are pertaining to this, but we'll just mention the one in Isaiah 3. Maybe we can see why it is that this occurs. And hopefully, as I said about the Iranians, there are several prophecies in Amos and Hosea and others in Isaiah to show how that God has, Isaiah the 3rd chapter, how that God has used a people or a nation to punish someone else or an individual. But yet sometimes the individual doing the punishing thinks that they are free to do it in the way, and with the recalcitrance and with the lack of mercy and judgment that they feel free to. And God is in the Bible in many places says He'll correct that stout-hearted that person for what they've done. But yet we need to know that we have caused reciprocity. We've caused people to reciprocate in the way that they have been treated. So in like manner, maybe this verse can be understood a bit better. Chapter 3 and verse 12, as for my people, children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. I think a new woman president or something in Bolivia, or one of these South American states. He says, O my people, they which lead you cause you to err and destroy the way of your path. So God says that children are going to be our oppressors. There are several places where it says the time will come when the son shall deliver the father up to death, and the daughter the mother. That type of hostility is coming. It also goes on to show that in the last days that men shall be lovers of their own selves, and it says in several places they will be disobedient to parents. But I wonder if we realize to what degree that we are responsible for the unleashing of that resentment. Now, not that the individual perpetrating the punishment is going to get off scot-free, they are not. But surely we can show God that we are not going to create an atmosphere that causes a person to think in their reciprocity of the way they think that they have a right to do what they're doing. And sometimes, like as not, which is bad news, that the area where the hostility and resentment is built up is not vented in that area. Someone else gets the brunt of it. Some unsuspecting, innocent individual, because God has given people free moral agency. And therefore, whom they want to punish, they decide to in this 6,000 years in which we live. So then we go on to show that there are prophecies for our time concerning children and the family, but God has a warning to children, to men, and to women. And I'll just read a couple of the things that I have down here concerning that, if I can find it here. It speaks about the, let's see, turn to 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, I think, 4 verse 8, and I'll see if we can get through a couple of these, about the warnings to those members of the family about the human carnal pursuits that lead to futility and do not bring about the result that He wants brought about in the family. 2 Timothy, I think, is 4, or is it 2 Timothy? Yeah. Maybe first, but we'll see. No, it's 1 Timothy 4 verse 8. He says, for bodily exercise profiteth a little, but godliness is profitable unto all things, having the promise of the life that is now and that which is to come. So he goes on to show that young people generally are involved with their anatomy, with the development of that anatomy, with exercise. And he says in this verse here, in 1 Timothy 4:8, that bodily exercise profiteth for a little while, and it really does. But he goes on to show the other characteristics that God wants us to seek profit, not only for the promise of this life, but for the life which is to come. And he's trying to let our young people know, don't get too bent out of shape about the physical things that we're able to do. Here in another place, it goes on to show that the glory of a young man is in their strength. That's in the prophecy, so I must hasten on to get through the sermon. It's in the Proverbs that young men glory in their strength, and the beauty of old men is their gray hair. So it shows that there are certain things about us that without the guidance of God that we really concentrate on. And because we concentrate on it and do not have the understanding of God, we are sort of sitting ducks for the pressures and dynamics of society and of a degenerative age that is soon coming to a close. So it tells young people to flee youthful lust. It says flee fornication. It tells us to do that, our young people. It tells young people, oh, don't let any man despise your youth. But it also warns that they should abstain from every appearance of evil, and says, let not our good be evil spoken of. Let not ourselves feel free to do things that's going to destroy unity rather than enhance it. There are certain warnings to a woman, and maybe Proverbs 11:22, we'll turn there just for a moment, because the Bible does say, favor is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a virtuous woman who can find. But yet, because of society and because of what we are exporting to the world, we export the worship of the human anatomy. And God goes on to show that the character which is involved inside, that righteous character, the development of it, is far more important to him, in the absence of which, in Proverbs 11:22, this is a way that he sees a beautiful body or a well-built anatomy. He says, as a jewel of gold in a swine's snout, so is a fair woman which is without discretion. So God tells us, do not worship the fact that we were blessed to be handsome or beautiful or whatever, but to be sure we're concentrating on what is inside, because those are the things that are eternal, and those are the things that we should be developing in our families. It says that a wise woman builds her house, but a foolish woman plucks it down with her hands. And it also goes on to tell the father, love your children and rear them in the admonition and nurture of the Lord, and that don't provoke them to anger. Don't provoke them to discouragement. But in the family, all these things I've just read are the things that are occurring. They are the things that are producing the resentment that is eventually, either in the family or outside the family, in some political office or whatever, going to be transferring and venting their wrath and their frustration and their desire to get back at somebody on all society. That's exactly what is happening. Look at the ones who are used in any nation for a revolution. Who is it? Not the older people. It's the youth. They're the ones who have the vision. They're the ones who are more pliable, but they're also the ones who are more irrational and more destructive if they can't be reached. So Ayatollah Khomeini, as one man said, I don't say disrespectfully, one of our senators said, Ayatollah Khomeini. He said that on the news. Well, anyway, he tells them to do one thing and they do something else. So it's like letting a bull out of a closet when someone's nature is being totally guided by emotion. So then God has warnings, but he tells us not to destroy the hope of our children, not to destroy the hope of our family. He tells the wife or the husband to love his wife as a weaker vessel. He tells the wife to reverence her husband. These are the things that have to do with the golden rule. The other things are the things that have to do with reciprocity. And it was amazing to me to even hear that, as truthful as it is, that people will usually treat you as they think you're going to treat them. Do unto others before they do unto you. We've had all these kind of jokes about the golden rule, and that's the way people go. But God says it takes character to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So then God warns us to become teachable. He goes on to show that the world that gives us the promises to come is that which is honor, and anyone who makes it there is honorable. But if you'll turn to Proverbs 15:33, he speaks about something that's necessary before the honor comes, which as time goes on is going to be totally absent in the world in which we live. Proverbs 15 and verse 23. I'm sorry, let's say 23, I meant to say 33. It says, the fear of the eternal is the instruction of wisdom. And remember that it says that upon the golden rule hangs all the law and the prophets. So the fear of the eternal is keeping God's commandments. The fear of the eternal is to be instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. So God says before we are honored, either we will bend our own knees, as Mr. Armstrong says, or because of the American dollar, as I hope Bruce will get a chance to give once he gave a lot of insight into what will happen to our monetary standard if they do what the Iranians are thinking about doing. They said they don't want any more American dollars to purchase oil. They'll only accept the Swiss franc, I think the yen, the German mark, and I've forgotten the other, the French franc. They'll only accept that. They won't accept anything else, and they are looking for other Arabic nations to do the same thing. That they will change the monetary standard, and if they ever reject our American dollar, Mr. Armstrong says, prepare to greatly reduce your standard of living. We are on the verge of that. The only reason it won't happen is that God won't let it happen. Now, we have time ahead. This prophecy to be fulfilled, but be very careful about thinking like the race of the tortoise and the hare. We have enough time. Because it may not be as much time as we think it may be. So then he goes on to show here then that before honor is humility. And of course Peter said to the elders in the 5th chapter of 1 Peter, be clothed with humility. But there are several verses here. Forgive me for running on, and maybe I'll help what my wife has said. You probably heard these verses before anyway. But in Psalm 49 verse 20, it says, he that is in honor, or perhaps considers themselves in honor, and understandeth not, is like the beast that perisheth. When a person is riding high in authority, whoever he or she is, and they don't have understanding, they are like the beast that perisheth, and like the saying goes, authority corrupts, and absolute authority corrupts absolutely. And we're going to have a lot of leaders in those positions in the near future. And we are in for a whirlwind. So it says that he that is with honor and understands not is like the beast that perisheth. He goes on to say, be not as a horse and a mule, which have to have a bridle, and they do not have understanding. He goes on to show that. A whip for a horse, a bridle for an ass, and a rod for the fool's back, it says. But yet God certainly doesn't want to call his children fools. But another thing it says also, a fool delights not in understanding, but he just wants to hear himself talk. He doesn't want to listen. He doesn't want to understand. He just wants to hear himself talk. It says it is a joy or a pleasure to see plans develop. Or it's a joy to see something that you're trying to mold come out the way that you wanted it to. But he says that's the reason why fools refuse to give up their plans, because it's such a pleasure to see something that we have created. But in many cases in the family, the man is trying to make his wife over in his own image. And the woman is trying to make her husband that idealistic figure she thought he was. And the parents are trying to make the children after their own image without knowing what image they should be following, are making a lot of Frankenstein monsters. And a lot of our older people are suffering from those very things, of people who are without total feeling today. So then we go on, and something was said out in the sermonette today that was really impressive to me, and I thought I'd put it in the sermon here by Mr. Hegmeyer. He said Leonardo da Vinci, pardon my French or Italian or whatever it is, but he lived back in the 15th century. And he told his son, he's one of the renowned painters in history, many of you probably know that, and he told his son in life that he should continue to look, and if he looks, he will see. And if he will continue to see, he will understand. And remember, the Bible says, he who is in honor and understands not is like the beast that perisheth. It said, be not as a horse and a mule who are without understanding. God goes on to show that the fear of the eternal is the beginning of wisdom. But it also says in Proverbs, if your hand is still there, if you'll turn to the 4th chapter, God tells us, and it's amazing how some things just come out that men say that actually are in accordance with what God's Word has inspired us to say. He told his son to look. If you look long enough, you'll see. Continue to see, and don't close your eyes, and you'll understand. And therefore it was said that back in the 15th century, Leonardo da Vinci actually conceived the understanding of the flight and aerodynamics, that he actually drew an image or a type of an airplane. He just didn't have the motor to put in it. And he did that because he observed the birds and the other insects and how they flew, and he conceived of man making a machine that many years ago that would fly. Of course, the Wright brothers and others actually brought it to fruition. But yet he looked until he saw. He continued to see until he understood, and then he was maybe a man who was 500 years ahead of his time. So then God goes on to show us in chapter 4 I think it is. Hopefully I'm in the right place here. Chapter 4 of Proverbs. And yes, verse 7. It says, wisdom is the principal thing, and therefore get wisdom. He says, but in all you're getting, get understanding. So that's what Leonardo da Vinci told his son. If you continue to look and see, you'll get understanding. But remember, men do not want to look long enough to see. And many of them don't want to see long enough to understand. And hence the scriptures that are fulfilled in the prophecy of Isaiah, their ears have they closed, and their eyes have they closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart. God says, and I should forgive them, this sin should be forgiven. He says people have closed their eyes. They don't want to look. Hopefully, that is not describing God's people today. For Mr. Delbert Peters, the man to whom I had reference, with leukemia, who maybe has, except for the grace of God, a few months to live, he has observed these things over the years, but he did kind of shake his head in wonderment and just wonder, why are these things happening? Well, God says that He will reveal those things to His people why they're occurring. So, what is understanding anyway? Why is it so important? Do you know it is a key to conversion? That if God stops a person from understanding, they can't become converted? But if He lets them understand, they must be very careful about what they do with what they know. Free moral agents, remember. So what is understanding? Part of this is, what do you want to call it, extemporizing, and part of it is just drawing on a lot of information that other people have discussed and said. But understanding actually answers the question, why? Remember, this, Mr. Peters said, why is it? And God says and shows us that understanding answers the question, why? Now, I'd like to go through a few things to tell you what understanding will do. And hopefully, whatever the spirit of it is, you'll be able to hold on to it. But understanding answers the question, why? It is a key to conversion, without which a person can't be converted. And God reserves understanding so that He can determine whom He's going to call and whom He's not going to call, who is ready and who is not ready. But understanding takes us back to origins and beginnings. That's why it's so important. It causes us to begin to understand the cause for the effect. It enables us to know very vital things because of depression, discouragement, and lack of self-worth and lack of self-esteem. Who is to blame and who is responsible for the thing we're trying to discover? It enables us also to properly use the influences in our mind of guilt and innocence. Those things all reside in our mind, and they all make us what we are. They all make us either accept certain things or retaliate or whatever. Understanding permits us to understand guilt and innocence. It also enables us, and this is a lost commodity in the world as time goes on, to learn to not only be patient with other people, but also with ourselves. Because the Bible says, in your patience possess ye your souls. It tells us to be patient. When you understand what's influencing a person's mind, it's far more easy to be patient with them and have a right attitude toward them than it is if we think that they're engaging in reciprocity, that they're only doing what they want to do and they could stop it if they wanted to. When you understand, you say, no, that's not true. That maybe they can't, and therefore I'll be patient with them. It also makes necessary another part of the human function of the mind. It enables us not only to forgive others, which really the Iranians are not doing now. They're not forgiving whatever contact that the Americans had with the Shah. Of course, from the way they talk about it, he was almost like a Hitler. And the people that he killed and imprisoned and tortured and brutalized, and he took billions, they say, of dollars out of the country, and that's what they want back. But they're so angry about him, and they want so much to judge him, contrary to what Mr. Vance was saying in his sermon, that they're willing to let the whole world shake and fall down to get him back. But they're not forgiving. But when you understand, and you understand judgment, well, you realize that God says that we should forgive others. As you would that men should do to you, do you even so to them, and forgive us our debts as we forgive others. So understanding enables us to forgive others. It also shows us the difference between apathy, empathy, and sympathy. Now, apathy means do nothing. Sympathy means be so emotionally involved that you can't help the person. In fact, you can destroy them. Empathy means be emotionally involved, be concerned, understand them, but back off far enough to be able to effect a solution and recognize that there's responsibility on the part of all parties involved. So understanding tells us when to empathize, and tells us not to sympathize, and surely don't be apathetic. It also removes the barriers to the changing of the mind when we understand, because the mind has a lot of barriers in there, and it makes permanent change possible. So God says when you understand that you are on your way to being converted, because it takes you back to the very origin and cause of everything, of course, which He can answer for us. And we do not have to fight ourselves or try to destroy other people. Character and personality are influenced by human memory. I was reading this recently in the Reader's Digest, and it's fascinating to me to understand, and I'll just say a few things concerning it. That at the present, an understanding of what human memory is, it has to do with something that they call engrams. Now, they say there are 10 billion neurons, I think they say, here, that constitute our brain cells. And all of them are connected together in something called engrams. And they say that these engrams are specific and individual memory banks for what we have ever done in all our lives. They're just like electrical circuits that have been wired at some time in our lives, and they function within our circulatory, our respiratory system, the function of our glands, our emotions, and they will continue to function that way, the same as you have a light circuit running through here. So they said these are the things that cause people to remember. They mentioned that there is such thing as episodic memory. And that means like you maybe want to remember a person's name or a telephone number or how to turn a key in a lock or something that's simplistic. But there's also semantic memory. They said it has to do with whole systems of memory, like driving a car, the alphabet, mathematics, or anything that you know that takes in a whole scope of things to remember. Fixed semantic memory banks that have to do with thousands and multiple thousands of facts that have been formed in your mind and my mind, and I function by those. I respond by those. And if you could see the concept of it, the engrams are as if some electrician was watching over my brain as I grew up, and he put these together and he put those together, and though I'm much older now than I was 5 years ago, yet I still function by those same things up and until I change those things. I will still respond and act that way. And it's a blessing if the mind has been properly programmed. It really is. You don't have to stop and think what it's all like. But the curse is that because God has not been dealing with each individual yet in this world, that the free moral agency that they've exercised and the wrong choices they've made have formed a lot of wrong engrams. And they are actually residual, and they do not leave until you tell them they have to leave. They'll just stay that way. Thankfully, if it's something good, it won't leave either. But naturally, being human, there aren't too many things in that direction. So God goes on to show then, or not God, but then it shows that when a person comes to recognize certain things about themselves and a need to change, sometimes it's so difficult or so far afield from what they would like to do or what they think would be pleasant to do, they go through something that Dorothy, what is her name, Kubler-Ross, discovered about people who are about to die. He says the first thing that they meet, and I think an alcoholic or a dope addict or whoever, and of course a human individual who needs to repent of being human, does the same thing. The first point that they go through is denial. When something's presented to them, we deny it. Now, that's a necessary barrier, but it can be also a cancer. You don't want to be hornswoggled and bushwalled or whatever you call it every time somebody says something, but then you have to be careful that when something is presented that would bring about change, that we don't resist it. Because first is denial. Secondarily, we bargain or placate. We try to get around it. You know, the thing looks like it's kind of real, it's not going to go away, but we try to bargain with it, and we do that with God. So secondarily, we bargain. Third, when we find out we can't get around it, we get angry. We really do. Maybe you've seen that. Or maybe you don't know that that's what occurs, but it does. And after the anger, especially when there's nothing that can be immediately done, then depression can set in. And I would say depression, I think I heard it explained once, in one sense, that depression is somewhat what a person experiences when they're deeply repenting. So it doesn't mean that the bombs you out and makes you want to kill yourself. It just means you're in a sober state of mind where you can be reached, maybe. That all of the pomposity and the vanity and all like that is for a time gone. So then fourthly, a person's depressed. But then number 5, Dorothy Kubler-Ross said that a person faces what's called acceptance. And I've added a couple after that. Hopefully, whatever a person's being faced with, that is reality, they will accept it. But then I added number 6, which is either acceptance or reject it. If something's presented to the human mind to bring about understanding, we may deny it, we may bargain, we may get angry, we may get depressed, we may accept it, or we may reject it. Again, free moral agency. And of course, number 7 is we have set our future course. But not only our future course, hence the meaning of the phrase that God says, I'm the Lord your God, and he says, visiting the iniquities of the fathers unto the 3rd generation upon the children of the fathers of those who hate me. So hence, once we set our course, and our engrams are set the way they are, if they're not set properly, then our children and those whom we influence actually begin to walk in the same way, and they begin to mimic and act the same way we act. And if what they're doing is not the golden rule, if it is reciprocity, hence we have all the struggle and the fighting and the muggings and the rapings and the pillaging and the robberies and everything we see today. That you'd better do unto someone before they do unto you. So then our course is set. Now there are three major influences in life, and I'll have to run through these also, that are responsible for the memory and the personality and the character that you have, that I have. Now I'll be general, I won't be necessarily specific, but hopefully we'll be able to get an important message out of it. If you want to know, maybe you've never seen me before, there's a way you could understand who I am and where I'm coming from and get to know me without ever knowing me. And you might say, that sounds ambiguous and confusing. No. If you recognize that people's minds are basically influenced, number one, by hereditary. They're influenced by what they inherit. Somehow the chromosomes and the genes have been programmed by God to pass things on from one person to the other. But I maintain that hereditary influences are passive. By that I mean they're not aggressive. If they aren't given a chance, they won't function. But anyway, if you want to say what is hereditary factors, well, okay, the way I look, my color, the texture of my hair, the fact that as I see and I marvel from day to day to see 4 or 5 members of a family sitting in the same seat and somehow they all look like each other, they may be grandchildren, they do. Well, that's an example of hereditary factors. That's something you have nothing to do with, but that you have received. Number 2, prenatal. That a person, when they are in their mother's womb, can actually experience things that for better or for worse that they will carry with them for the rest of their physical and natural lives. Whether it be nutritional, emotional, chemical, or whether it be as far as their nervous system is concerned, or dietary, whatever. It's been programmed and found out that the baby's nervous condition, what the mother, if the mother takes drugs, or whatever, it does get through the placenta, and it does cause problems. And they realize that when you see a human being walking around, you think they're responsible for what they've done. Not in all cases. Sometimes it was what was going on when the mother was carrying the baby, and it's possible, and I was talking to a member here about this, and I want to be careful about everything we talk about, but God says, prove all things, that the emotional state that the woman was in when she was carrying the baby can affect the emotional state of the baby when the baby's born as a human being in a negative way, if the father and the family atmosphere is not right. Somehow the baby can experience that, even as perhaps you may know, that if a woman is highly nervous and upset, if she nurses her baby, she can poison it. To show you that can happen. So the emotional that affects the baby is true. Okay, so then going on. Number 3 is most important, environmental. It's environment, and it's our upbringing, and it's our family environment and all the community environment that really is the force acting on the engrams in my mind. And if it's a right society, then my mind will be right. If it's a wrong society, then I'm going to get what they hand me. And I will be struggling in my converted years against mainly what that has done to me, environment, not what anyone else necessarily as before I was born. To say, well, he's a chip off the old block. His father was an old fire hoot, and so is he. Not necessarily. We learn to express temper and resentment and anger and hatred and lack of mercy and vanity and nonsense. Of course, we get help from other sources. So environment. The next one is personal choice. So we have hereditary, prenatal, environment, personal choice. All of these are what forms my personality and my character and the memory that I have. And depending on where I came from or where I was blessed to be reared, so goes whatever I may express to you as you try to get to know me. So then going on, let's see, which one did I have there? Understanding what was going on. There's an end result of you might say, well, what kind of life did Maceo live? You can tell. Because either I will come out just like my background. Now that is an extreme for the purpose of the sermon. Any extreme is bad news. But I will come out talking like, looking like, acting like, having gestures and everything else like somebody that made a great impression on me when I was younger. And it'll be exactly like them. So maybe, hence, an alcoholic son may have come from an alcoholic father. A parent who beats their children that can be accused of child brutality has usually been a child that has been beaten. A man who can't love and be patient and understanding and forgiving and solicitous is someone who in many cases did not experience it themselves. Okay, you come out just like your background to try to show you how important the family environment is. Number 2, we come out the opposite. You ever known anybody who won't touch a drink of alcohol? Not even on a Passover they don't want to? 9 And 100% out of 10 times, that person came from a home where they suffered so much under the misuse of alcohol that they programmed their engrams, I will never touch a drop. And even you read the Bible to them, tell them Christ made wine, everything else, but they just say, no way, I'll deny it, I'll placate it, I'll do everything else, but I never will touch that wine. So God, as Bruce said in the sermon, don't push a person like that. They've got to see that for themselves. They've got to look long enough to see. And they've got to see long enough to understand. And that's in God's hands. But then we come out the very opposite of our background. Number 3, we come out a mixture. You find some people who are frugal financially, some people who are hygienically pure, they're just clean. I've known of people who maybe clean their babies up and give them a bath 2 or 3 times a day and dress them up like little Lord Fauntleroy. But you know what that boy did after he was grown? You know what he looks like? You want to guess? Looks like a tramp at times. He really does. He got so tired of taking those baths and walking around and having to walk around with his stiff shirt on that right now, if you knew him, you'd understand why there's such a marked contrast between what his mother said she did for him and what he, as a young adult, is doing today. We will be a mixture, or we'll be the very opposite, or we'll be just like. Now, number 4, we come out balanced. Sound the trumpet, do something, where is it? But that's rare. So then, there are 3 major barriers to facing the change. I have these, and maybe I better stop saying we may not have time to do it. You'll say, well, why don't you quit while you're here? There are 3 mental barriers that will result in the mind of any person who is in an environment that is not necessarily wholesome and productive. And hopefully you can grab these. Number 1, the child who hates his parents and the environment or the treatment that he has received will compare himself with how his peers are treated and come to the conclusion that the parents or the environment are wrong and not the child himself. But their future problem will be overcoming hatred and forgiveness. That if we continue to create an environment where a child is being put down, or a husband is being put down, or a wife, whoever, and if they begin to see, well, look, and understand, and look and see and understand, well, look, I'm not to blame for what they're doing for me. They may be in a position where they can do nothing about it, but 9 times out of 10, they'll develop a seething hatred. And that hatred has to be constantly reinforced by excuses. Engrams? Now, their problem as an adult is they got to realize they shouldn't hate. They've got to realize they should be willing to forgive. Remember what understanding does. But they've got to knock down these myriad excuses that justify why they have a right to hate. Now, they developed that before they understood. But as an adult, that's what we're fighting when it comes to change. All those excuses and all of that, and remember, sometimes it vents itself at the perpetrators, the parents or whoever, and sometimes anybody who's in the way gets it. So then, number 2, the child who did not hate their parents or the environment, they believed the accusations of the parents. Now, it could be sincere or whatever, but whatever they were deprivating and they were putting the child down. Environment against them. They did not become bitter, but yet they developed an inferiority complex, receiving, they never understood, or let's see, I have something down here that's been typed wrong. But anyway, they develop an inferiority complex, and their problem will be recognizing who they are and what their potential is, and stop putting themselves down and begin to recognize reality. Because a person who is told something about themselves that's not true, if they accept it, then they begin to fantasize or live in a non-realistic world, and they do not realize what is true about them and about life. And as an adult, they can still do that, and you're trying to convince them of the facts and the checks and balances of reality, but yet this put down that they have accepted all their lives gets in their way and is in another way called inferiority or lack of self-esteem and lack of self-worth. And they have to remove the barrier that has given them reason to believe. And sometimes they respected the source so much that they think to reject the actions is rejecting the source, and that's not true. You can love someone who has been not the wisest individual in the way that they handled you, but you better admit what is true. Because remember, life will function as our minds have been trained to function, and if what we do that is right, fine, but if what we do that is wrong, then somebody's going to suffer. But God shows us that if we suffer long enough, hopefully we'll change. Number 3, the person observes what society is doing to itself and understands that none of us is totally to blame for what we received as a child. It avoids being judgmental. It begins to see judgment the way Mr. Vance said we should in the sermon last week. Pointing and not pointing the finger at others or at themselves, it says, somehow gets the big picture and develops a balanced mental outlook without any major problems or disagree of any either hatred or any feeling of inferiority. Their future problem, inferiority complex, hatred of themselves, lack of self-esteem, and lack of self-worth. I think that this person is a balanced person, and they actually don't come out with the lack of self-esteem. They don't come out with the inferiority complex because they understood what was going on, and they didn't let their minds seethe in resentment and hatred toward other people, or else they didn't let themselves receive a lot of put-downs that in their adult life they're still accepting, and they came out balanced. Now, there are such creatures in the world today, but somehow they got some kind of input that most of us didn't get. But I'll hasten to say as we go on that we are building and molding these mental attitudes in our families now. And the degree to which prophecy is fulfilled in your home and my home, where my children may rise up and throw me out or use a law that they're trying to get passed to give a child more authority, whether or not they do that or not might have a lot to do, and I know it does, with the way that they understand what I'm trying to get across to them and the attitude of mind and hopefully humility that I hope I have in the process. So then there are people who are growing up with inferiority complexes that they need to change. They need to recognize that God says that there's nothing He's made imperfect in that way. We've got a long way to go. But God saw that all things were good when He made it. But there are others who also have grown up with a lot of hatred, and the ones who caused the problem are way back there somewhere, and they're giving it to somebody today. And the person that they really are giving it to is up there, but they can't reach him. So then whoever is close to him is good enough. And they never can understand or draw close to God in that way. So let's go on in another thing here. There's a profile of today's youth. And I'll mention some terms just for today, and maybe later on we'll go through them. But there are things that affect the life of a child, of an adult, that they have no control over in a sense. There's such words as puberty. And puberty is the age that the body begins to function biologically and chemically, where the hormones are manufactured, and the boy's voice begins to deepen. The girl begins to look no longer like little orphan Annie. She begins to look like, Gigi, who just grew up overnight. And the boy's voice deepens, as I said. He begins to grow a mustache, and he almost, puts a fence around it to be sure it's not shaved off. But yet one other thing that occurs is the person begins to be to the place where the girl begins to menstruate, and the boy is able to actually father a child, and that can happen as early as maybe 13 years of age. And one way you can find how profound that is, in one paper we were reading recently, there is a eunuch. He's supposed to be the last of the Chinese eunuchs. He's 90 years old. His name is Mao something. And he says that he was castrated, and that means to have his reproductive organs cut out of him when he was 4 years old. And he said it took him 4 months to get over the physical wounds, and he said he hadn't gotten over the spiritual wounds yet. But they said at 90 years old, his voice sounds like an old woman. That the voice of an individual is so affected by the age of puberty that if there's any damage done to those reproductive organs, it shows that that voice will not deepen. And I don't know about the development of his body. I would even imagine that certain parts of it didn't develop. So then a person begins to develop at that time, but there are forces acting in him that have been triggers that they have nothing to do with. And it can be proven that the mental state and the confusion or the insecurity and all the rest that a young person goes through when they approach puberty can be tantamount to what a woman goes through in menopause. And a lot of it is as imaginary, although a lot of it is actually true. And there are times when the frustration of no longer being a child and depending upon their parents is countered by wanting to be free to do their own thing and make their own decisions, yet realizing they need their parents, but yet feeling too constricted if the parents give them too much direction. And they're in a state of confusion that we need to understand and read about. Because if we don't understand that we add insult to injury and we create a crisis for them that should not be created, if we could get them to understand that they've got to work with it and master it, unto you shall be his desire, it says, as God told Cain, that you shall rule over it. So puberty. Now there's another called adolescence. And it's been said that according to the culture in which people live, adolescence comes at various ages. Evidently it came for Jesus Christ around the age of 12, because his mother and father found him in the temple with the doctors and the lawyers, asking questions and answering them. But for some people, an adolescence is a time when the child begins to have to accept adult responsibilities. And I think it's in our nation that it comes much later because we have such educational longevity and all the rest, that the things where a boy would come out and try to have to be a man in some nations comes later for our country. But yet, they have to make the decision. There's a certain amount of security and peace that comes when a person knows they can handle that ominous, difficult future. So sometimes they're in a hurry to get to it. Of course, sometimes they realize that they shouldn't run out there, but then many of us, like the prodigal son, have to go. And so God tells us, let them go. But don't tell them don't come back. just realize they have chosen to learn by the school of hard knocks, wish it didn't have to be that way, but train them up in the way that they should go. And when they're old, they'll not depart from it. Now, there are such things as the early maturing child and the late maturing child. The responsibility, remember, the body worship that we engage in the world, especially in this nation. If a girl is 9 and she looks like she's around 16, what's going to happen to her? What the guy's going to do? What's it going to do to her own personality, her own necessarily trying to earn what she gets and all the rest? She's going to be thrown out there in the adult responsibility she's not ready to handle. And the boy, the same way, who begins to develop with muscles and athletic agility and all the rest, if he's doing that maybe 5 or 6 or 7 years before his time, society puts a pressure on his mind that puts a scar on there that he's wrestling with for the rest of his natural life. Now, on the other hand, the late maturing individual, that means the person who comes to puberty late. The girl who maybe is 16 years old and looks like a beanpole. Somebody laughs. And the boy of himself. The boys are still up there when he's talking to all the guys and cracks and all like that. They laugh him to scorn. And he suffers from that. He doesn't even know what it is, and we don't know. Why don't you talk differently or whatever? You know? Well, the late maturing, the early maturing. There's also a generation gap. Another important thing. And that means that here is reality as to what we really are functioning at, the level at which we're functioning. Number one. Number two is the level to which we can obtain in our life. That means if we push and we work and we strive and we try to change our engrams, we can reach number two. But in most cases, either we or those who set the standard before us have a third, unobtainable area that is idealistic, that is the same as fantasy, and we can't get there, and they can't get there, but we're striving like somebody climbing up a grease pole trying to get up to that idealistic state so we can be accepted, but it's unobtainable. And the tragedy is that we get frustrated and defeated and almost somewhat hypocritical and almost have a schizophrenic personality because we cannot obtain it, but we think it should be obtained. And sometimes we have set standards too high for people, and they are not themselves as a result of what we've done. So then puberty, adolescence, late maturing, early maturing, generation gap, we didn't discuss that. Also the gap of tragedy, and it really is a tragedy, because we can even have spiritual gaps of tragedy, where you think what you and others ought to be doing spiritually is unobtainable. And therefore we don't let a person live and be themselves and force them, as it is said with our children. They live one way at school. They have another life they live at home. There's another life they live at church. And we as adults sometimes live one way on the job, one way around our friends at home, and when we come to church, we're always a different person. And that can be hypocrisy. But sometimes the environment forces us and won't let us be ourselves, so we just go the path of least resistance and do what we can. But these pressures are what's causing all the troubles at home, that is causing us, as you really look at it, Mr. Armstrong said, prepare to live on a tighter monetary standard. You know that without the family's cooperation, without the wife and the husband saving second tithes, it's almost next to impossible. Unless somebody just says, I'm going to lock it up in that safe, and you're not going to touch it, I'm not going to touch it. You know that the whole family, when things get tight, have to cooperate, and no one can be selfish. No one can be demanding things except what is best for the whole family. That as things get tight, we have no gas and have no jobs and have no food and have no fuel oil, that if we haven't learned to sacrifice and cooperate with each other, that we are going to fulfill prophecy in our homes and someone will take your food out of your mouth and maybe kill you if you don't give it to them. We have to learn now. And we must look until we see. And we must see until we understand. And when we understand, we must begin to act on it. The family is a very important place of development. So I'll just go on now as far as conclusion. We need to prepare to grow and to change. There's a parable in the Bible, I think it's Luke the 5th chapter, that speaks about the wineskins. You know what it says even in this article about the brain? You've heard the phrase, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. You'd be surprised what society tells us we have to do when a man gets to be 45, when a woman starts going through the menopause. If you get to be 60 or 70, your mind's going to become senile, and you're going to do this and do that. That's a bunch of hogwash in most cases. There is such thing as senility. There is such thing as certain physical transitional periods as a man grows up. But the main thing that we struggle against is what we have programmed into our mind. And I don't mean to lift ourselves our own bootstraps. This article said that the brain will stay functional, and you can still remember and still be productive as long as you use it. Look at Mr. Armstrong. Oh, he's the apostle. That's the reason. That's not the only reason. For some reason, Mr. Armstrong doesn't live in the past. Oh, when he goes to his autobiography, he does because there are lessons back there. But he's still looking so much to the future that he thinks like a man who's 40, 30 years old. And we can do the same thing because he has always said for years that the most difficult thing about changing is unlearning. And so unlearning is getting rid of those old engrams and letting them be reprogrammed again and being replaced with the right ones. And then if any man be in Christ, he is a new creation. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. 2 Corinthians 5:17. They can pass away. The Bible says, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind. But sometimes we fight so long and run up against so many barriers that we don't see and don't understand, we finally give up. I think I told you once about the big fish. There was an experiment made one time where there was an aquarium, there was a tank, and there was a big fish in one end and a little fish in the other end. And the big fish used to run as little, would have to do. The little one doesn't run the big one. The big fish ran the little one all over the tank. I guess he was glad when the big fish went to sleep at night. So once somebody took a glass plate and put it in the middle of the tank so the big fish couldn't get to the little fish. And the big fish kept bumping his head against the tank, the middle barrier, bumping it against it. I don't know how long he did it. After a while, he gave up. Now, it was said this happened, that one night when the fish was either preoccupied or asleep, they took the barrier out of the center of the tank. And he never went to the other end. He had tried to get through there so long that even though the barrier was removed, he stayed in his end. And sometimes we have struggled so hard against some things that even when the door is open, as far as we're concerned, it's not even there. And therefore change cannot be effected. But Mr. Armstrong says, yes, we can. We can look ahead. And we can redevelop our minds, and we can use our minds. And there's one way. Turn to Malachi 4. Of course, without the proper goal, this can't be obtained. Therefore, God permits some, and I mean this in a way of necessity, not in a way of disfellowship necessarily. The Bible says they went out from us because they were not of us. If they had been of us, they would no doubt have remained with us. But they went out that it might be made manifest that they were not all of us. There are kids in YOU who are not trying to change. There are kids who are trying to go to the Bible study. They're trying to go to the Bible contest. They're trying to be what they ought to be here. And there are other kids who don't want to be that way. And so eventually they will leave. But hopefully we don't say, good riddance, let the door hit you where the dog bit you. We just do as the prodigal son did, and we just say, okay, go. But hopefully the day that they arise in the slime pit and eating with the sow and have spent all their living and have gotten bombed out, maybe with syphilis or whether financially or been in jail or whatever, when we see them coming back, hopefully we'll run and throw our arms around them and kiss them and give them a ring. But right now, they've got to find out that it can't be done here, and they've got to leave it for those who want to do it. So then here, God says in Malachi, the 4th chapter, if I can read it here, and begins in verse 13, speaking about free moral agency and what happens when so much evil is perpetrated, and we try to understand why. This is the conclusion some people come to. He says, your words have been stout against me, says God, saith the Eternal. Yet you say, what have we spoken so much against you? You have said it is vain to serve God. And what profit is it that we have kept his ordinance and that we have walked mournfully? And that just means mournfully. Humility is not an action, it's a state of mind. Before the Eternal of hosts. And now we call the proud happy. Yea, or you call the proud happy. They that work wickedness you set up. Yea, that tempt God are even delivered. Then, when things got this bad, and they are getting this bad, brethren, this is what is supposed to happen. Then they that fear the Eternal spoke often one to another, and the Lord hearkened and heard it, and a book of remembrance was written up about those before him for them that fear the Eternal and that thought on his name at the time when things got that bad, on his name and on his purpose. And they shall be mine, saith the Eternal of hosts, in the day that I make up my jewels. And I will spare them as a man spareth his own son that serveth him. Then shall you return and discern between the righteous and the wicked, between him that serveth God and him that doesn't serve God. He says that time has come upon us. So then maybe in conclusion, turn to the Psalms 45. That Mr. Armstrong has said that prepare to greatly reduce your standard of living. But remember that the stresses that go on in your family and in mine, the pressures that your children are under or that they create, all of these things are producing resentment and frustration that either will come out in your home or mine, or it will be among those of whom it comes out when the whole world is going to be at war, trying to pay somebody back for what's been done to them. And again, in most cases, the people who receive it have nothing to do with what actually occurred to them. That's what's going to happen. People have to fight, and somebody has to pay. But in Psalm 45, God lets us know that this is our family. If for some reason we've lost a lot of those whom we love. And he says here in chapter 45, in verse 10, he says, "Hearken, O daughter, and consider, and incline your ear. Forget your own people in your father's house." So when they say over there that the Iranians are going to let the blacks go, I tell them, you never open that trap for me. Because you know, of all the Jews that were killed in Germany, the 6 million, and the Poles, and the Czechs, and the Hungarians, and the rest of them, they said that Hitler had plans for the blacks. I heard one of the plans. He thought they were dirty anyway, so he was going to put them all in a camp and cordon them off and give them no sanitary solution and let them all die of disease. But you don't see that in the picture. You don't hear about that. When the Iranians are trying to survive over there, every face goes. And so this country is not to be disunified by a gesture like that, but God's church must recognize that we are a family, and we must let nobody divide us for any cause whatsoever, for we are the people of God. So chapter 45 again, it says here in verse 15, "With gladness and rejoicing shall they be brought. They shall enter into the king's palace. Instead of your fathers, there shall be your children." This is speaking of the kingdom of God. "Whom you may make princes in all the earth." So God says if we do our job, not only will we be in the family of God, but even our children at that time, and it's been said and speculated that they will not be changed into spirit, but they will be the physical leaders, the presidents, the mayors, the governors, and the leaders, the emperors, if we want to call it that, in the world tomorrow, who at that time, with the help of God and a right society, will be setting the right example. So then please remember, as Mr. Armstrong had said, and I put it down here, to sound the alarm in deadly earnest, which said God is about to speed up events. So this is all the more reason why we should wake up to the signs of the times and redouble our time on our knees, on searching our own engrams, our own soul, our spirit of repentance toward God, and increasing faith in Jesus Christ. So, as it said, forewarned is forearmed. So hopefully, as the world goes the way it's going, and as God grants those of us here, the article Mr. Armstrong is going to write, look forward to that. Bruce said this morning that he is concerned about prophecy, but he wants to wait until certain other things are more definite, so you might pray about that, because God is to inspire us at this time to know what's going on, and in the meantime, we should certainly be preparing ourselves.
Additional programs and literature available at hwalibrary.com.